Welcome to Hell of a Pitcher. I am one half of your co-host, Andrew Bartlett, and I am with my close, dear friend, Mr. David Hollingshurst. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing good. I'm using my regular voice as opposed. You put on the fun voice to start. I really dug that. That was good. But I'm going to.
I try to switch it up
cadence. Yeah, no, it's good.
Yeah, I try to switch it up every podcast. Still a little different take on those intros. That's today, good. We are talking about our third Nolan film. We're going to finish the trilogy, and we're doing Oppenheimer. Most recent Best Picture winner, Oppenheimer. It's Nolan's most recent film, and it's the biggest film of last year. Before we get into a deep dive, Dave, I'm going to throw to you to give us the rundown of the film.
All right. We'll keep workshopping that as well. We'll tinker with the rundown. But okay. In sum, Oppenheimer is the story of titular character Julius Robert Oppenheimer, played by Cillian or Cillian Murphy, depending on how you want to say it. I think he prefers Cillian. He is a brilliant young theoretical physicist who was selected by Lieutenant General Leslie Groves, Matt Damon, to head up the U.S. Army's research into atomic weapons. Robert recruits and leads a team of scientists who essentially move into quarantine for the duration of what would be called the Manhattan Project. And the movie tracks the development and ultimate use of the bomb, as well as the personal relationships and professional trials of Oppenheimer. The film's non-linear story focuses heavily on Oppenheimer's trial, which isn't really a trial, over the renewal of his security clearance and the dredging up of his many errors in an attempt to discredit him. It was released July 21st of 2023. It was directed by Christopher Nolan, written by Christopher Nolan, but based on the book American Prometheus: The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, It had a budget of $100 million, and it brought in a whopping $953.8 million. And that probably doesn't include any kind of home box office or anything like that. It stars essentially everyone. If you are an actor of any repute, you are in this movie. Even if you are just like in the background holding a microscope or something like that, you had a spot in this film. So it's an absolute banger. It won a great many Oscars, as you mentioned, including Best Director, Best Picture. Downey Jr. got Best Supporting Actor. Cillian Murphy was Best Leading Actor. It was an absolute tour de force. And what else can you say? Nolan has his laurel here, right? I mean, this is a big one for him, and he was presented the award even for Best Director by Steven Spielberg. So, as we talked about previously, you sort of had this passing of the torch of the the man in big cinema, and I'm excited to talk about this. It's a very significant film for a great many reasons.
Great little background on the film. The couple of things I wanted to bring up right off the hop. This film was shot in 65 millimeter IMAX. So it's a huge format, like huge as in like it captures a ton of stuff. The DP, along with Nolan, the DP's name is Hoyt van Hoytema. Who
you have to have an unpronounceable DP. If you're going to have a good picture, you need a DP of unknown abstraction. Like, where's this guy from? Hungary? Maybe
it's a Dutch name.
Dutch.
It's a Dutch Swedish. Yeah.
Switzerland. No, I think it's Dutch.
Todd Gack. He's born in Switzerland.
Okay.
To Dutch,
which is perfect
Dutch
because
parents,
Switzerland is sort of this melting pot of like different like European cultures. Like it's part German, part Italian, part French. It's
exactly.
It's like the ING Direct guy. Remember those ads? Save your money, and he just had this like completely unplaceable accent. Excuse me. Anyway, sorry, I digress. Carry on.
He has a quite a impressive list of films from he's worked. This is the fourth time he worked with Nolan: Interstellar, Dunkirk, and Tenet. He's worked with shot Nope. He shot Ad Astra. He shot Her, The Fighter, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. He has a incredible list of films he's done. So together with Nolan, they kind of decided they wanted to shoot this obviously on IMAX, but they very distinctly have half the film in black and white, a sort of to distinguish time, different times, different moments in the film, and different timelines, I should say. But they actually went to Kodak to get them to develop 65 millimeter film, IMAX black and white film. So a lot of people would watch this and be like, okay, they just shot the whole thing in color, and then they kind of in post they would translate it to black and white. That would sort of be the easy route. But shooting it on black and white film, which was something that was very important to the both of them, it gives it such a distinct look. The shadows, the highlights, the vignetting, everything that you get with film versus shooting digital, it creates such a powerful image. And it was very important for Nolan to do that. So they had to actually go to Kodak and be like, listen, we want to shoot this on black and white. And they're like, well, that hasn't existed for decades. Black and white, like 65 mil film. And they're like, he's like, well, can you make it? And they're like,
I'm Christopher Nolan,
guess.
you know?
What do you think?
Don't make me call Steven Spielberg, okay? Don't make me.
So they developed it, and yeah, the whole thing is sort of shot on film. And the interesting thing is the first kind of topic I want to bring to you. So they shot this thing IMAX. When you think of IMAX, you're thinking, okay, I'm going and I'm seeing this grand, huge picture. Maybe it's a war film, maybe it's like a superhero film, maybe it's a space film. Nolan decides to shoot this on IMAX, and like half the movie is close-ups of Cillian Murphy, his face. Like that's the iconic shot of this movie, is that stoic shot of him sort of at the very end of the film. And he kind of keeps going back to that shot in various stages. They had a great quote where he said, the face is like a landscape. So it's like you could see almost every crevice, even in his face. Now, when you're watching it, and especially if you saw it in an IMAX theater, to be truthful to how they wanted somebody to experience the film. But did you think that was an interesting way or an interesting choice by Nolan to kind of present a film that's a very intimate and intense film, that it has explosions, it has big moments, but to kind of really use this IMAX in a way that's sort of never been done before. It's never been, they've never been films where it's like close-ups on faces and just like in a tight room, in an interrogation room, you're using an IMAX camera. It's like, did you feel like that really got across in the film?
I mean, that's interesting. I feel like there might be some kind of meta aspect to that. Just in that, with the trial scenes where he is, under this heavy scrutiny, there's almost this, it's a very, he's under a microscope. He's under, he's being examined and scrutinized in a very, very intense way. And there's almost something maybe being said there in the technical choice to show things, to film it on IMAX, to achieve that level of detail, that maybe relates to the way he's being treated in this trial sort of part of the film. And you talk about the detail of the face. One of the things I noted really acutely about Cillian Murphy's performance in this is just how expressive his face is. And it's almost like he has this resting face that is totally not his own. It's really quite astounding, actually. Like just the way seems to have total command of his features at all times in this movie. And I thought the performance that he gave was so brilliant and nuanced in that way. The sound of his voice, the way his face moved or didn't move, there was almost a robotic, like an android quality to it. It was like he was sort of learning to show emotion or something like that for the first time, which is really interesting. So, yeah, I mean, I hadn't considered fully the significance of using the IMAX, technical sort of component of it. But I think, whether, I don't know if you would know, like if there would be something lacking without it. Speaking as a layperson now, right? I mean, I don't have the technical background, but speaking as a layperson, I don't know what we would lose. But knowing it's there and thinking about it in that way, I think is pretty interesting. And certainly, there, like you say, there are traditional IMAX moments in this when you're looking at the explosion, when he's talking about nuclear reactions and things like that. It's almost there's some things that are reminiscent of Interstellar in that way. I think the impact of the IMAX cameras comes across in that, and maybe it's one of these things that you do for the sake of doing, creating this whole kind of film. Do most people really appreciate that? I don't know. I like hearing about it. I don't know if I noticed it in the moment or really, appreciated just how significant it was in the moment, but I certainly appreciate hearing about it now. And I admire, the commitment to the pursuit of the craft.
The pursuit of the craft, I think, is important because the filmmakers like Nolan want to, because something is easier or more accessible. And that's not even to say that shooting on film is hard. It's like, yeah, it's scary, but film is forgiving and you can do, but like the textures, the richness, the authenticity that film provides really is pretty astounding comparatively to digital. But the look of the film is so important, and for Nolan, the practicality and the tactileness of film and how he wants to shoot effects was another important aspect for him. Like all of those effects, all those like quick inserts of explosions and sort of neurons spinning, and there's a scene where he's in bed early on in the film and he's sort of like thinking, and there's this like spinning thing kind of in front of his face. That was Nolan with like this little like essentially I don't know, like a little stick with like a ball on the end, spinning it around in front of Cillian Murphy. And he's just like sitting in bed, and it's like everything is practical. When Nolan's making a movie and he's saying, okay, we're going to do this explosion, and it's like, yeah, they're not going to drop an atomic bomb, but
no, they built an atomic bomb. They enriched all the uranium on site. That was practical, of course.
Exactly, but they have to figure out a way to
plutonium enrichment. It's right there.
Everything that you would think, you can just we can do that digitally, or we can do that, and we saw that in Interstellar, and you see it in like Inception. The Inception, I referenced this before too, the Inception where they built the hallway for the hotel battle. And they they're literally spinning this set, and it's...
They even do the MC Escher stairs, when they're sort of talking about perspective. And so they actually built that staircase, and, instead of just doing that, with computer assistance, it was actually a weird staircase and a trick of the camera, which is just so impressive.
They have to Nolan, it's such an important aspect of filmmaking. And maybe it certainly helps him as a director, and it helps with his stories, but it's also just feels like a more authentic way to make a film, but
there's something nice in that, you know what I mean? Even if it's not necessary necessarily, like, you know, it's there's a preservation there, I guess, of the craft. To go back to the idea of the craft, and whether or not you need to do it is less important than maybe there's something sacred in doing it. So there is something holy almost.
Absolutely, there is.
You know, at the altar of film, to do these things by hand, to go out of your way to get a form of film that is not commonly available or ever made, you know, to shoot small intimate scenes in IMAX for the sake of his, you know, his vision, his idea, and maybe something more meta too. You know, there's a nicety to that. I do appreciate it. I really do. Whether or not I necessarily recognize that in the moment, but even hearing about it after the fact, I do appreciate it, and I'm glad he does it.
So I want to jump into the film itself and the story of the film. You know, you mentioned in the rundown that, you know, it's Oppenheimer, and he's sort of a conflicting character, and this is a very conflicting story of his adult life. And I want to talk about how the film is it's a long movie. What is it? 3 hours? Over 3 hours?
It is 3 hours. I think it's 179 minutes. So it is, 2 hours and 59. So it's
like three. And I want to talk about how the film's kind of broken down into 3 acts. The 3-act structure is something we see in a lot of films. Nolan is not, it's not new to Nolan to have the 3-act structure. This is very distinct though. And what's interesting, I think, about this is he has this 3-act structure broken down, but then in classic Nolan fashion, he jumps around. You know, he does the non-linear way of storytelling and filmmaking. Mm-hmm. So for me, the film, the 3 acts are as follows. We have the hero's journey. So you're familiar with the hero's journey, is the first act. So I always sort of reference the classic is Luke Skywalker. Like,
it's the coming of age of the hero. Yeah. You know, you meet, it's discussed very much in Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces. That's
exactly.
Yeah.
So you have this hero's journey. We're introduced to Oppenheimer, and, you know, he's sort of a professor, I guess, at this point, or he's like he's
a student, at Cambridge. Initially, when we find him, he's at Cambridge.
Oh, right, yes.
And at first, he's
screwing up math problems, and
he's not a good practical physicist. he's a theorist at heart.
You know, and then we follow him along, and he eventually gets the Manhattan Project, and then the movie sort of shifts gears into a heist movie, which was very interesting. I heard in an interview with Nolan where he's talking about that sort of second act is a heist movie. And in your head, you think about heist movie, you think, you know, Ocean's 11, Heat, like physical, actual heists, where it's like, but really it's about a group of people together going to an objective, like a
collaboration and problem solving.
Exactly. So he has his group of scientists. They're trying to kind of solve the problem of, how to create this nuclear weapon, and they eventually do succeed. And then it shifts again into a courtroom drama, and like very on the nose, like a film noir, old school courtroom drama with the senator played by Robert Downey Jr. and his another senator, I believe. It's the I guess his cohort or whatever, where they're sort of talking about what's his name, guy who played Solo.
Excuse me.
This is the problem with this movie. There's
so many freaking people. It's impossible to.
Alden Ehrenreich.
There you go.
Alden Ehrenreich.
How could you forget that?
So
name?
he's the age.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Well, you could forget Solo, that's for sure. But,
you were best to forget Solo. In fact.
So yeah, anyway, he's the aide to Strauss, who was played by Downey. And yeah, it turns into kind of this courtroom drama, kind of interspliced with the finishings of his sort of interrogation, which sort of plays as a courtroom drama. These three kind of very distinct, different ways of presenting a story are kind of at play, and they really work well together. You kind of wouldn't really think they would, because usually a film is like the whole thing is kind of one of these distinct ways of telling a story. And then on top of that, he kind of throws in a bunch of different genres. He has a Western feel, like this, like, and it's not just the hat that he uses, which was very unique to Robert Oppenheimer. Like he had that hat, this distinct hat, and that was like super important for the whole film. But they go out to New Mexico, and it's
effect. You need that affectation.
Exactly, and they. It's like the new the westerns, the new frontier. They're building literally built a town, which is like such a west. It feels like a western, and then there's horror aspects in it. The horror, like there's this like unnervingness. There's this, okay, what if this happens? And then they're not really thinking about that, but they should be. And then it's really terrifying. Even the intro where they kind of have the quote, the Prometheus quote, I think, where it's like the explosion. You're like, oh shit, this is going to be scary. What's happening? And that's that third kind of courtroom drama act really feels like it becomes like almost like Frankenstein, like the movie of this person has created this monster. Now the monster isn't a physical monster, but it's a bomb that could literally end the world. So did you feel like this idea of like Frankenstein or this horror aspect kind of jived with every other act of the film?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the Frankenstein aspect?
I mean, I love that, and I love that you brought up this kind of melange of genres, which I think is really cool. And one thing I noticed, and it didn't really crystallize in my mind until you brought up the horror thing now, but you do get this. There's a few points where you hear this stomping of feet. It's really brought to a full in that moment where he addresses the scientists after the successful detonation of the bombs, but you hear it a few times throughout the movie. Stomp,
are you talking about
stomp.
Are you talking about in the in sort of the rally when he's like sort of like?
Yeah, when they're in
lucky
Los
the
Alamos,
Germans weren't.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's like I don't know how the Japanese felt. I'm sure they didn't like it, and then you have that he has that vision, where people's skin is being sort of flayed from them by the radiation and the heat of the nuclear detonation, which is pretty jarring. But there's this. When he's going in there's this stomping of feet. Everyone's sort of chanting for him, and they're stomping. And you hear that a few times throughout the movie. And that really gave me this sort of foreboding kind of sense. Like there's something is looming. Something is coming. There's that march towards something. It's inexorable, and it's frightening. It is very frightening. And you are absolutely right. He is Frankenstein in a lot of ways. Obviously, the book, The American Prometheus, and Prometheus, the Mary Shelley work, Frankenstein, the Mary Shelley work, was subtitled The Modern Prometheus. And he has created this thing which is now unleashed and that can't be put back into the bottle. The bomb is a scientific discovery that defined an era and continues to loom over, the world of geopolitics. And the film ends with that idea that they've started a chain reaction. There was that debate during the scientific aspect of the film about the fear of a chain reaction that would ignite the atmosphere. They couldn't stop the chain reaction once it had started. And interestingly, yes, they do start a chain reaction, but not in the way that they initially feared. And the Frankenstein idea continues. It also applies to his downfall. And how the mistakes he made, all of his own doing, led to his undoing. It was all very petty things in a certain way, but certainly petty when compared to the creation of a nuclear weapon. But his continued association with communists, that was not a good idea, right or wrong, to fraternize with communists at that time was a very fraught thing to do, particularly for someone in his position.
100%.
There's a legitimate security concern there, obviously, as evidenced by Klaus Fuchs, one of the scientists on the project, who was a Russian spy. He's introduced in the movie as an English physicist, and Oppenheimer asks him, when did you become English? He says, well, when Hitler told me I wasn't a German. So you have a German Jew who has, managed to flee Nazi Germany, join up with the English, and then be sent to this the Manhattan Project, and it turns out to be a traitor all along. So obviously, yes, there was rampant paranoia, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't actual security concerns. So Oppenheimer does do himself in. He probably shouldn't have kept his security clearance. Now, that's one of the big sort of debates around in this movie surrounding him and his ethics is, should he be allowed to continue his work? And probably not. As much as he is meant to be sympathetic in this, I think, and how there is no actual evidence of him being a traitor, he did do this to himself in a lot of ways, as much as it's being done to him by Strauss or Strauss. Did you know that, so this is a little deviation, but the Robert Downey Jr. character, Strauss, as he calls himself, he is actually, his name is Strauss. He just changed the pronunciation because he didn't want to sound Jewish. He wanted to have a more sort of folksy Southern kind of vibe to his name. And so he changed it. But continuing with the Frankenstein thing, it works in so many ways. He is the architect of his own demise, much as Frankenstein was. He has released a new aspect of science on the world which cannot be put back in the bottle, much as Frankenstein did. And so it's it works really well in that way. And so there absolutely is this horror aspect to the movie. And the Western thing was super cool too. I really enjoyed that.
Do you think that the question of Oppenheimer's morality really comes across in the film? Because I feel like he is presented as a very sympathetic character, and you're like, oh, I feel bad for this person. But, in the same light, you have to remember what he did. Mm-hmm. And also, aside from the fact, he's this brilliant physicist. He's, heading up this huge project, like the biggest scientific advancement in, one of them in the history of mankind. It's like, he is also kind of a dick, like, sure. and not even in a sense, like he's cocky and he's like, I think about the scene when he meets General Groves, and mm-hmm. he's like, didn't you research me? And it's like, oh yeah, and I'm brilliant and all this sort of, they kind of have this snippy back and forth. There's also numerous times throughout the film where he cheats on his wife, or it's mm-hmm. alluded to that he cheats on his wife. Oh, yeah. Later in the film, they talk about, but he obviously clearly does. So it's like, do you feel like there is a moral, obviously people can have differing moral opinions on things, and it's like, what does it mean to be moral and do the right thing or whatever? But that's sort of a bigger question. But I guess somebody like this, who is presented sympathetically, I think, to the viewer, is a very flawed character. Mm-hmm. And it's like, can you separate whether he, like, his moral decisions with relation to the bomb and his moral decisions as a husband or a father, or like a boss, because he's running this program, and mm-hmm. a lot of the scientists don't like him, So
sure.
Do you think that there is a moral hierarchy, I guess?
Yeah.
Like, does one moral choice?
Yeah. I think it very purposely, the film takes time to examine both the larger moral debate. I think the moral debate that most people would attach themselves to when it comes to Oppenheimer, the discussion of the ethics of creating the atom bomb. And so it talks about that, and it also talks about the personal more intimate ethics of the man, as you mentioned, with his infidelities, his arrogance, just the qualities of him. And it's interesting. The first time I saw this movie, I really thought it was very pro Oppenheimer and very framed him as a very sympathetic character. And I thought maybe excessively so. And the second time I watched it, I sort of thought it was a little, I didn't think it was quite as pro Oppenheimer. It still frames him sympathetically, and you are meant to like him in a lot of ways, which I think is important for storytelling. And we talked about this with The Following a bit, but I didn't see it as a total sort of canonizing of Oppenheimer. I think it's a pretty good analysis into how we look at people ethically, and it's kind of an insight into the way we can hold people to unreasonable expectations morally, like standards that we wouldn't necessarily hold ourselves to. If they had shied away from the infidelity and things like that, I would criticize the film for it. But they do show it, and I think it raises a point. Like, fooling around on your spouse doesn't make you a bad person. I think it makes you a bad partner. And there is a distinction to be made there, because you can fail in that way, and I think be successful in other ways. Like, more than one thing can be true. You can be a cheat and a cad, and you can also be a very commendable person in a lot of ways. And surely, Oppenheimer does have commendable things. He's a great scientist. He's a towering intellect. He's also a human being. He's flawed. He's arrogant. He's self-pitying.
Right.
But he holds strong convictions where democracy is concerned. The idea of global government, he's very supportive of that. He takes an intellectual interest in communism, sure, but we probably all should. It's important to explore those things. He has a resolute objection to fascism, which I think we all should. But being flawed, I think it makes for a more interesting ethical discussion. I think that's really what this film is a lot about. It is a discussion on ethics, and there is a lot of sort of armchair moralizing in the world today, and probably not enough self-examination with a similar level of scrutiny. And I don't think this is an interesting movie unless Oppenheimer is as flawed as he is. And I think the moral failings in his life and his work really enrich the story. I had a conversation with a colleague at work the other day talking about Oppenheimer, and he denounced the film just categorically based on the idea that Oppenheimer cheated on his wife. And he couldn't appreciate a movie that venerated a guy who fooled around like that. And I was struck pretty soundly by that objection for a few reasons. And first, I think I mentioned this already, but in a character piece about the father of the atomic bomb, I didn't figure the most fervent moral objection that a person would have would be over marital indiscretions. Seems like there's a larger ethical issue here.
Right.
Secondly, as I said, I wasn't entirely sure the movie venerated Oppenheimer to the level he was talking about. And third, do we want sort of puritanical lead characters in our film? Certainly in a historical biopic, I think a character portrayed in that way would be a lie.
Absolutely.
It would be a lie. And I'm not sure I'm interested in seeing a movie about an infallible, unimpeachable person. I'm not sure that person exists. So, this goes back to The Following. Do you need to, we said there, do you need to like a character in order to, or does a character have to be, can a bad character be sympathetic? I think was the question there. So here I feel it's more like, if you disagree with the ethos of a film, the statement of a film, or the actions of a character, can you still like the movie? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I strongly agree with that statement. Like, you can, some of my favorite films have, horribly flawed and morally incomprehensible characters.
Yeah.
My favorite show of all time, aside from Seinfeld, is probably Sopranos. And like, Tony Soprano is a awful human being.
Yeah.
Like an absolutely awful human being. And how he's like, but you do find yourself becoming sympathetic towards him in certain aspects. I think that's what makes the films, a lot of the sort of the greatest films ever made, just interesting. More interesting is when you have not flawed in, how a hero is, can't rise to the occasion because he doesn't have the abilities yet, or he's learning, or like the most interesting characters, like you said, are sort of people that are flawed, or that morally flawed too. Like I mentioned Luke Skywalker before, and it's like he's on the hero's journey, but his flaw, it really isn't like a moral one. It's just like, I'm not good enough yet.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in New Hope and like Empire and stuff. But like I'm getting there. I'm just flawed as in I'm not good enough. I have to learn, and I don't want to learn because I want to be really good now. And that's sort of like presented even in the first half hour of Star Wars. I mean, that's a bit of a tangent. I don't know why I'm bringing up Star Wars, but I guess my
there's
point
never
just
a
being
wrong
that,
time
like,
to bring up Star Wars. I just want to make that perfectly clear. So you have total liberty to bring up Star Wars at your leisure. Please continue.
I like how you said that, like, okay, if the film didn't focus on, or didn't at least bring up his like infidelities, or present him in not so favorable light sometimes, or just like overly cocky people that we sort of just like, I don't want to be associated with this guy, he's like an arrogant prick sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would have obviously made a totally different film, but also a totally different lead character, and wasn't authentic, I think, to the story, or to his life, because he is a flawed human being, like we all are. But like,
Yeah.
I mean, the very beginning, one of the very first scenes of the film, he's like injecting cyanide in an apple to literally kill his professor,
which
like,
actually happened. That is based in reality. He did seriously contemplate poisoning his professor.
So I'll say that, like, I think we can both agree that, like, how he is depicted, I think he is depicted in a fair light, in his moral dilemma, but also in his, his flaws. What do you think about the films, like, in general, how, I want to say certain historical events are depicted? So one of the, I guess, omissions of the film was sort of the actual depiction of when the U.S. used it,
Mm-hmm.
in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And like, do you feel that? I mean, we don't see any of that. We sort of see the explosion in these inserts or whatever, but
Mm-hmm.
like, we don't ever see the actual devastation, except from when they're kind of discussing it with the Secretary of Defense, and they're sort of like, oh, how many casualties, how many people do you think will die? And then after, during the courtroom stuff,
Yeah,
we never see this. And that was sort of an issue for a lot of people in the film. It's like, you're not depicting the actual, um, you know, effect of what this bomb created. Do you think that the film would have been better if it had focused a little bit more on that, or is that something that we don't need for this story, because it's while it is about the atom bomb, it's about Oppenheimer.
yeah. I mean, yeah, like
Obviously
you say,
it's about Oppenheimer, but you know what I mean.
yeah, it's a character piece, and like we were just saying, it's a character piece used as a mechanism for moral debate, and the kind of moral
Gotcha.
questions
Right.
that we
Yeah.
always need to keep having. Whether or not the conclusion is ultimately the same or ultimately ambiguous, it behooves us as a people to constantly question these kind of actions. And yeah, the inclusion of the bombing. It's a good question because the film is so long, and I hate to quibble over length of movie when you're talking about something so so atrocious, so appalling as the nuclear bombing of two cities. Right. Do you need it? I don't know. They do talk about, there is a scene later in the movie where he's at a presentation of some kind, and they're talking about the resulting, the deaths, the how people died. They talk about people with striped clothing were found burned with like stripes on their body and stuff like that. And there was even the ones who climbed out of rubble who were spared immediate death died afterwards in from radiation sickness, and upwards of 200,000 people, eventually died. So yeah, would it have benefited from actually showing something? Like, I mean, you could have had a moment, a scene. Would it have changed anything for me? I don't know. It certainly, I guess it would have changed things for certain people, because I have heard that objection, particularly from some people in Japan who saw the movie and thought, well, you could have taken some time to show the horror more distinctly. So I think it's a fair objection that people have. For me, I don't think I needed it necessarily, but I can understand why people would want it in there or would criticize the film for not showing it. And, when you make a film like this, I think you open yourself up to a lot of criticism. Because, again, going back to this, it does take a stand to a certain degree on Oppenheimer. He is, like I said, I don't think it doesn't exonerate him entirely. I think it allows you to have the discussion and to have your own thoughts. But yes, you are meant to root for him in a certain way. And I think, if you're cheering for the Downey Jr. and the tribunal, then I think you have missed the tone of the film. Like you have not like gone along on the journey that they wanted you to have. And this idea of Oppenheimer and his place, it brings me to an idea that I couldn't get out of my mind watching this movie. And I'm going to jump into a bit of historiography here for a moment. And namely, it's sort of these competing ideas on history. You have the great man theory and the great forces theory, or sometimes it's called trends and forces theory. The names of each tell you most of what you need to know, but in short, the great man is this idea that history is shaped by the deeds of heroes, essentially, going back to what you're talking about, the hero's journey. Singular individuals who are either super intelligent or ambitious or brave or what have you, and they are what shapes our world. The competing idea is that, well, no, even though you have exceptional people, it's also the work of generations and thousands of people contributing to furthering ideas, and it's all of that, this confluence of things that takes us to where we go. I tend to lean that way in terms of my own interpretation of history. It seems to me, though, that Nolan and Spielberg would be adherents to the great man idea. Probably, in no small part because it's conducive to storytelling. Our mythology and most of our narrative are sort of replete with heroes and messiahs. We friggin' love a messiah. It's also appealing, I think, to people who achieve things, people who are maybe in their own mind a great man. It's very romantic to think of yourself in that way. And it's probably, it exonerates you to some degree. It lets you sort of hold yourself to a different standard. And because it is the tendency of people who subscribe to this idea to be apologist where a great person's failings are concerned, i.e. in the case of Oppenheimer, well, you can forgive him cheating on his wife. You can forgive him maybe not being a great father. In fact, there is a scene where they actually hand off their child to someone else and say, like, can you watch our baby? And the person is really accommodating. They're like, yes, you're doing important work. We will do this. And, that's kind of, well, not kind of, it is shitty. You should take care of your children no matter what your job is. This idea of greatness excusing you from certain morals. It's almost like, it's sort of like the way, like I think rich people tend to think that money is meritocratic, that you have money because you earned it or because you deserved it, which is demonstrably false. But, it's a similar sort of excuse for people with great ability that, the ability absolves them of having to adhere to what the rest of us are sort of expected to. And one of the reasons I like this movie and one of the reasons I find it repellent is the discussion that takes place around this idea. And I want to know, we've danced around this a little bit. Do you think the movie is exonerating Oppenheimer as a great man? And do you think he needs to be? Like, what is your, like, ultimately your moral stance on Robert Oppenheimer and his actions? And I'm speaking both of his personal failings and but probably more so the larger, aspects of his work and the atomic bomb and stuff like that.
I mean, this is what makes the film so incredibly, it's such a great story to tell, because it's such a conflicting idea, right? Like if he hadn't kind of done this work, and it's almost like they start in a place of honesty and like, okay, we're going to try to create this atom bomb because we have to create it before the Germans. And
Yes.
if we don't create it before the Germans, they're going to use it. And then literally it's going to end the world. So it's like, we have to commit the sin before the bad guys, so to speak.
Yeah.
The great thing I think about this film is, and kind of Nolan as a filmmaker in general, a lot of filmmakers tend to give their opinion in their work. And I really felt as sympathetic as he was presented. I think the fact that he was presented as having such strong convictions, and I think this was Oppenheimer as a person as well, such strong convictions about how to use it, or like just having a powerful weapon like this. He really presents it to us as the audience. I don't think he is saying in this film Oppenheimer was a good man that, had to do this thing, or I don't think he's saying he was he made a terrible choice that's incomprehensible and he should have never done it. I think the goal as a filmmaker is to present the question to us. And that's what the debate we're having and the discussion we're having right now. We're debating this, like, well, was he morally right? Or did he make this? Should he have done this or shouldn't he have done this? And that's for us to debate and decide. I don't know really where I stand on it. But that's not for the filmmaker to decide for us. Right. So that's what I think the film does really well. It sort of like presents this question. Was he morally correct in doing in making the atom bomb? Like, were we as a society morally correct in doing this? And, I think if I had to choose, or I had to like say which way, I think it does lean towards like, this was the right decision.
Yeah.
But also,
I think it's one of these,
that's
sorry. Continue.
Yeah, that's sort of, I would lean towards that. I would sort of lean towards that's what the movie's trying to say. It's a horrible thing, but it's like sort of, this is the world we're living in, and that's unfortunate. But the real kind of aspects of the film that really hit home for me, I should say, was he's talking to the general, and he's sort of like, they had referenced it early in the film, but when they're about to do the test, and he's like, yeah, well, what was that side bet about?
Yeah.
He's like, oh, well, there's a chance that it's going to essentially blow up the whole world. And Matt James was like, oh, yeah, like 0%. He was like, it's near zero. It's all theoretical, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of theory versus like practicality, which is a driving force in throughout the whole film. But it's like, that was like, oh, that's the part that hit home for me. Because like, I think growing up for us, we were sort of past the generation past that sort of like the fear of nuclear war.
Not the Cold War
that's
ended.
very obviously it's a very big thing now, but at the same time, it's like, it's sort of been around and established in our culture and in the world as a whole now, that it doesn't feel as like just massive as it was then.
Yeah.
And the idea that you're going to run a test and this chain reaction might end the world. It's like,
yeah,
holy gosh.
Yeah.
Like,
it was not unthinkable that it would ignite the atmosphere and destroy all life.
The stakes,
it's incredible.
The stakes can't get any bigger. This
Yeah.
is the biggest stakes there are, right?
Mm-hmm.
For us as humankind. I'm going to say that the idea that the film, I feel like did really well was display that idea of massive stakes and like massive, like this is the biggest, something that Nolan does well. Again, like he did it in Dunkirk, he did it in Interstellar, in Inception. He's taking these large, big ideas and making them feel like even bigger, or like as big as they are, like, you know, world-ending things, or, you know, it just works. And for me, that aspect of the film is hits the nail on the head. Do you
sorry, go ahead.
Do you have any follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, just sort of continuing a little, just one final bit on the moral aspect of it. You know, I think you brought up, you know, that the Americans weren't the only interested party in pursuing this technology. The Germans were, the Russians were, presumably at some point the Japanese would, etc. And so there is sort of this sense that it kind of behooves you, if someone's going to have this power, you better have it too, as a means of counteracting it. So right. I think sort of where I fall historically on the ethics of creating the bomb, I think it is a regrettable thing that had to be created. I think differently about the implementation, the use of the bomb, because there is a very good historical argument to say that it didn't have to be done, that Japan would have surrendered. Now, people would say, yes, they would have, but you might have had to invade the island, and how many lives would be lost in that. But, you know, you had Russia bearing down from one side at this point. You had America coming from the other. You had just firebombed Tokyo and killed 100,000 people, something that's often forgotten about. And no, they hadn't surrendered at that point, but to say that they wouldn't, there afterwards, you could put them under siege. You could cut off their resupply. I think there were a lot of things that could have been done short of using the nuclear bomb. I'm not a military historian or an expert in any way, but this is just what I've heard in these debates. There is a very, very rich and contentious discussion around the necessity of using the bomb twice or even once. And many people will say that it was in a lot of ways just sort of posturing for the Soviets to say, hey, we got this thing, don't, F around and find out, so to speak. And so, yes, I mean, I think where I fall on that moral side of it is that, no, it should not have been dropped. It should have been created. Regrettably, yes. But I cannot countenance the use of the bomb. It's really quite appalling.
The before we get into whether or not we think this is a hell of a picture, I want to touch on a couple things that didn't quite work for me, because I do love this film, and I think I had a lot of issues with Tenet, his film he made before this. And I thought it was problematic and confusing. And the one thing I think Nolan does, it was sort of a return to form for him, I feel like. I really loved Dunkirk, and I thought that was kind of a great way of telling a story and based around World War II. And Oppenheimer, I think this was a really unique and interesting way to tell the story of a flawed and historical figure. With that being said, it's like, I don't know if Nolan is like too smart, or he's like, because he's not like a scientist or a physicist, or like he has people that he's like bringing on stat. Like we talked about that when we talked about Interstellar, like all the science had to be right. And that's was,
he clearly has a great reverence.
Like a lot of the dialogue in this. Yeah, of course. But the dialogue, and it's like, I don't think he needs to dumb it down. And he does have a great way to like get across ideas and plot points, you know, with science slang. But it was like to the point where, and this is again, to the point of like, wait, okay. So that when he's making an atomic bomb, but then there's somebody who wants to make a hydrogen bomb. Wait, there's a fusion and fission, like one's slicing it and one's like, and it's like kind of confusing. And it's, sure. But like for the sake of the story, I don't think we necessarily needed all that to like be dumbed down, but that's just sort of like a little bit of a quirk that I had with it. I'm just like, and I think on top of that, what makes it even more confusing is just the giant cast.
Oh
and
my
like,
gosh. Yeah.
Like you mentioned in the beginning, it's like, it's great. Like, okay, so this random one scene with a you know, a sergeant or whatever. It's like, oh yeah, that's Casey Affleck. It's like, wait, what?
Yeah. Daniel Day-Lewis plays
Malek's
a Bunsen burner. You know,
it's like it gets to be a bit ridiculous. And then you're like, okay, here's this person, and it's like, but then there's like all these scientists, and then there's like scientists from different time periods, and then there's politicians, and it's like it just gets to be overwhelming. And you're like,
it does.
Then you get taken back when you kind of like, when you see somebody that's sort of out of context, right? Like, okay, if you're watching a movie and you know, it's Casey Affleck's the star of the movie, you're sort of like, okay, I'm not that it had to be a no-name actor, but it just felt like, you know, maybe you could skew it, like you didn't need that guy in that moment, or like, or I don't know. I'm just playing for Casey Affleck.
It can be distracting. It can be distracting when you get this deluge of stars. Yeah, and like I think you mentioned this when we were talking. You're like, it takes you out of it, kind of. You're like, oh, it's Casey Affleck now. Oh, that's Gary Oldman as Harry Truman, and it can be distracting from what you're trying to watch. I agree with you entirely.
Yeah, it's sort of like, Gary Oldman showed up and you're like, oh, this is like one scene, and it's
I wouldn't mind seeing a movie with Gary Oldman just playing Harry Truman. I think that would be that could be an interesting movie. I thought he was fantastic as Truman. If you've ever seen any historical footage of Truman or heard him talk, Oldman does a pretty darn good job, which is unsurprising because Oldman is friggin' awesome.
I don't know, like, and Rami Malek, he's a fine actor, but like, he's just sort of like that Rami, like, this is the Rami Malek guy, and then it's like Josh Hartnett shows up out of nowhere, and it's just like, not out of nowhere, but he's like,
I'm really happy for him. I don't know, I'm happy he's working. I'm glad he's back in the fold. I feel like something happened there. He was he was exiled for a while.
It just feels like it wasn't a large ensemble piece as much as it was like a character-driven piece with Cillian Murphy.
Yeah.
But again, it can sort of be overwhelming and it can get confusing at times. And then you sort of, I think the key to making a great film is, we had mentioned earlier on another podcast about like the rewatchability of it. You want to be able to go back and rewatch it a bunch. But I also think at the same breath, like, you shouldn't have to go back and watch it again to kind of fully get it.
Yeah.
I think it's important if you go back and watch it, you get new things from it. Like every time I watch this movie, I'm finding out this, or I'm feeling this, but like I'm watching it through, I'm like, wait, okay. So, wait, when are we, or like what is happening? And it can get a bit confusing, which is kind of, Nolan can be known for a bit. He can have a sense of like, especially with like a movie like Tenet, where it's like, what the hell is happening?
Yeah.
And it's like ambitious, and it can kind of get a bit like, look how smart I am.
Yes.
And I don't think he's doing that on purpose, but I just think it's like he's staying true to a lot of the science and a lot of the characters and throughout Oppenheimer's life. How about you? Did you find anything that was like story and morality aside that sort of like irked you a bit or kind of threw you off of the scent of it being a hell of a picture?
Yeah, I mean, you talked about rewatchability, and I remember the first time I saw this, I remember saying, "Oh, I've got to watch that again." And it wasn't necessarily because I was super excited to watch it again. It was more like I need to get a handle on this. Like it's just it's like reading, one of these really dense fantasy novels, with a whole world of cultures and various peoples and stuff like that, and just you need a cast of characters and like an appendices in order to track it all, and you need that for this movie. Like all these scientists they had important contributions to the project, and but you lose track of it all. You absolutely do. And another thing that I griped with was the Emily Blunt character, Kitty Oppenheimer.
We haven't even talked about her yet.
No, but I mean, like, she was nominated for Best Supporting Actress, I believe, or Best Supporting Actor in a female actor in a supporting role. Didn't win, but was nominated, I believe. And I found that really surprising because we don't really get much from her for about 3/4 of this film. It's only in the last few, the last bit when she gets called to the stand in that broom closet courtroom, where you see just what an awesome character. All of a sudden, she's the coolest character in the movie. She gives him the best advice on how to deal with this, which is to tell everybody to piss off. And she's the one who has the insight to say that it is Strauss pulling the strings. They all think it's Borden, this guy who wrote the report and submitted it to the FBI with dredging up all these accusations about Oppenheimer, actually saying he is committing espionage and all this stuff. And she has the insight, and she has the guts, more than any of these other guys. And she gives this great performance in the last 30 minutes of the movie, but we don't see it. Like the whole movie before that, she's just drunk. That's all she is. And she has this change, and I could countenance the change if there was some kind of journey or if something happened, but nothing happens to change her. She's still the same person. She's still a drunk. It's just now that we get this, I feel like we were robbed of this really cool character that could have been a factor throughout the movie, and we only get it at the very end, which I thought was really disappointing and a waste of a character and an actor. Other things. There was some stuff. Sorry, go ahead.
I can just jump in on that.
Yeah.
With the interesting thing is Kitty, Kitty Oppenheimer was it's sort of like the whole thing was like she was a former member of the Communist Party. Mm-hmm. That was the big thing. And that was a huge part of her life, obviously, and the character. But like she was a scientist. And like by all accounts, historically, she should have been part of Los Alamos, and like she was there, but she wasn't as a working or scientific aspect in this part of the story. But that it was sort of presented as like she's just this kind of character that married a scientist, and now she's left the scientist, and she's she's just moved on to Oppenheimer. But like she was an actual this like brilliant scientist that should have been part of the work, and that sort of was something that never got addressed or it was just like you said, she was drunk. But it wasn't a question of like, well, why is she drunk? Yeah. Or why is she like, doesn't like want to raise the kids? It's like, it's sort of implied. You're like, maybe she was like used to work and she but like, that's never really investigated. And then it's like, okay, now she's going to come to the rescue at the end. Like you said, the last 3.
She's incredible.
And
that scene where she just
that
sort of
scene. Yeah. In the interrogation room, it's like, it's so amazing. She has that flip and she's so, but we saw it when we talked about the Fablemans back with Spielberg. And it's like, you could have an actor come in for a scene or two. Now, granted, she's in the whole movie, but like when Judd Hirsch comes in and he gives that like performance in those 1 or 2 scenes, and it's just like, oh my God, like that scene for me is one of the best scenes in the whole film in Oppenheimer, when she gives her rebuttal and she's just that performance, and it's zooming in on her and it's like, man, she is killing it. And it's worthy of an Oscar nomination. She didn't win it, but like you said, I feel like we maybe were robbed a bit of her sort of like very interesting character as well.
Yeah.
It was like she was serving the Oppenheimer character versus like, having sort of an interesting story herself. But again, the story is about Oppenheimer, about him.
It is, and you can't include everything. One interesting thing, one interesting omission from this story, there was actually a reporter embedded with the Manhattan Project, a New York Times reporter named William.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, William Lawrence. Sorry, I just want to get his name right here. William Leonard Lawrence,
Man,
aka
cool.
Atomic Bill. And there's another world where this movie is sort of told maybe through that perspective of the embedded reporter, and it's kind of interesting. So, like, obviously, it's a huge story. You can't include everything. If you tried to, eventually you would end up with nothing. So, I can understand that you have to leave some stuff out. But yeah, the Emily Blunt character, or lack of her, kind of felt like we were robbed a little bit. And another thing, you came up with one of the tagline for this show about what makes a film or a movie unforgettable, and not just because of the scope and all the characters and stuff like that, but I think in a lot of ways this movie is kind of forgettable.
Interesting.
I don't think of like any great moments in it that like rouse sort of feeling in me. I think of it as a really good film, a really good movie with great performances. It's 3 hours, but it keeps a very crisp pace. I appreciate the fact that it doesn't sort of dumb down the science in any way. I appreciate the reverence for science and how it shows this is sort of a follow through from Interstellar, but it's amazing how as soon as they finish making the bomb, the military just appropriates the whole project. It's like, thanks for your input, doctor. Yeah. We'll take it from here. And I think there's a jab there at how society treats science and scientists. But in a lot of ways, this movie is kind of just, I don't think I will remember it in the same way that I remember Interstellar or Inception. Like we talked about, we kept going back to the scene in Inception, in the hallway, and the MC Escher stairs. And there's so many things. And Interstellar, the wave scene, and there's so much in there that I can't get away from, or I won't ever be able to forget. I feel like in a few years I'll probably watch Oppenheimer again. Like I'll go back to it. I think the moral discussion is the interesting aspect of it, and needs to be revisited. But I don't, in terms of the movie itself, there's not a lot that I think of as being indelible. Did you find that? Like, can you think of things in there that you're like, I'll never forget that? Or that scene's going to stick with me forever. Did you find that?
Well, I did.
Okay.
And I found it more, I got more from it the second time I watched it. And I feel like it's a movie that I'll revisit. Like you said, maybe not all the time, but from time to time, just to kind of like try to pull more, I think, from a more of a technical filmmaking aspect of it. Sure. That's where I really saw and really felt the impact of the movie. And it's like visually how incredible it really was, and a feat to create something like this. And like you said, the moral aspects of it and the storytelling is great. I think I can continue to take more from it as I move forward. So I guess, like, with everything that's said from your aspect, I think it's that time of the podcast. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I know what you're going to say now because of what you just said.
Yeah, I may
turn your key. Actually, turning your key is pretty appropriate for turning your key is appropriate for this.
It is
hell of a picture, David. Will you turn your key, and will you make this a hell of a picture?
Man, I am quite torn, honestly. In the same way that Oppenheimer is
that's
a
what makes
divisive
this podcast
character.
Great, man.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in the same way that there's an ethical debate on Oppenheimer and on the whole idea of atomic energy and weaponry. I feel similarly torn on this movie as a hell of a picture. I almost wonder if this were made by someone else, would I be more inclined to give it up for it? And I also think Nolan makes two kinds of movies. He makes sort of like concept pieces like Interstellar and Tenet and Inception. And then he seems to like to make sort of movies like this and Dunkirk, historical kind of epics, like, or at least that in his most recent run, say of the last 5 films or so, those are sort of the split, I think he makes the conceptual stuff better. I don't think he's as good at doing historical epics. I saw Dunkirk in the theater. I have not seen it since. I could have seen it since. I don't really have any great desire to see Dunkirk again. I'd watch it again in the interest of the pod if we were to do it. But I didn't love it. I didn't think it was anything. I didn't think it was a masterpiece. And I like a lot of stuff about this. I just don't. I don't know. I don't think it resonates with me quite hard enough. I don't know. I'd revisit it, but for tentatively, I think I'm going to say no. I think I'll say no.
No, so this is going to be a first for us.
Okay, it's a 1-1.
I'm absolutely turning my key. This is not, by any stretch, it's not my favorite Nolan, but I think for the historical importance of the film, for the technical achievement of the film, for the moral quandary of the film,
mm-hmm.
I think it's definitely worth being a hell of a picture. And so this is the first film we haven't agreed on, which is great. We were waiting for this,
mm-hmm.
and and that's good. I don't think you're debating whether the film is an achievement.
No, I like it. I really like it. I enjoyed watching it, and I will watch it again. But I just don't know. I would come back to it though. I'd be totally open to reopening the debate on this because it deserves it.
This is interesting. It's interesting because we chose 3 Nolans to do, and he got one hell of a picture. And people might I think he's going to be a director that down the line for us we will probably revisit, whether we do the Batman trilogy or we do Memento and Inception and Dunkirk, or we do a bunch of other films. The great thing about Nolan is that when comparing him and looking at like the career trajectory, I guess, when you kind of look at somebody like, if you want to say Spielberg's like sort of halfway point in his career to this point. I mean, Spielberg's 78. He's already said he's going to make a few more movies, but like, how many more does he have, sort of thing?
Yeah.
His halfway was like sort of Saving Private Ryan. And a lot of people think that's his best film, but
Mike Winter does. Our dear friend Winties. That's his put on in the background.
Certainly
movie,
does.
If you can believe that. I mean, my gosh.
Can you believe that? Putting it on in the background.
Falling asleep
to do like study or whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, this, I'm excited to see what Nolan does next, I guess is my point. Like, if this is sort of the pinnacle, the peak of his powers, he's won all these, finally won his Oscar, Best Picture Oscar, Best Director Oscar. He's built a career up until this point. I'm interested to see sort of where he goes, if he keeps sort of going upwards or if he, his films sort of peter out. It's hard. You look at Spielberg's second half of his career post Saving Private Ryan, and he has some like bangers in there, like some really good movies. War of the Worlds, Munich, like recently West Side Story was like phenomenal, and like Fabelmans I loved, but like they're not quite as good as like the Indiana Jones and the Jaws and the Close Encounters and the ETs, the early stuff he did. This is something that Tarantino talks a lot about. Tarantino has been like, I'm making 10 movies.
Mm-hmm.
He's got one movie left in that, if you're considering the Kill Bill movies as one. So it's like, he's making 10 movies. And a lot of the reasons he says is like, he's like, I don't want to be, just like hanging on. And like, he's like, I like the idea of 10. I like the idea of it being like, every one is like this important piece of filmmaking. And there's something to be said about that. And it's like, I don't think Nolan's not there, but like, if he's halfway through his career, it really will be interesting to kind of see where he kind of takes his career from here.
Yeah. And there's an interesting thought on, do you run out of creativity or do you lose something as an artist over time?
Right.
Or are there only so many good ideas in a person? Maybe that's the case. maybe it's a matter of energy. I mean, just obviously it's definitely taxing making films. It has to be. And you think about Spielberg as a in his advanced years, are you just able to dedicate yourself to it in the same way with the same alacrity as a younger filmmaker? So it's an interesting discussion on artists and how they age.
Yeah, it's exciting but depressing because like I don't know, I just think about like the filmmakers that we grew up with, and like you said, I said Tarantino's got one, said he's got one left,
which is sad.
I look at Scorsese, and Scorsese is what? How old? Like
I think he's older than Spielberg.
Be in his 80s now, right?
Yeah.
I think. Yeah, he's got to be older than Spielberg. And I mean, how many movies? It took him like 3 years to make Killers of the Flower Moon, and like so he has what, like 1-2 movies. He's got one in development right now, but like yeah, it's like you don't want to think about that, but at the same time,
it might be nice though to make some room for new voices. Because these guys do sort of suck a lot of the air out of the room. There's so many opportunities, and so many people just want to give them projects. And maybe now, we get some exciting new people coming up and getting an opportunity. So there is a silver lining.
Well,
potentially.
I'm glad you brought that up. Because Dave, that brings us to what the film we're doing next week. And where we're pivoting, because we've done our 3 Nolans, and you know what? We do want a new voice in the room.
Yes, but
we want one that's got oomph and a lot of style, and is very topical, and especially topical with Oppenheimer. Next week, we're going to be tackling Greta Gerwig's Barbie, which was arguably the biggest or second biggest film of the year last year, coinciding with Oppenheimer. And, everybody talked about them opening up on the same day, and, them doing the Barbenheimer screenings where people would see both films. And there was all this sort of like, going back and forth between the two.
Yeah, there was a humorous juxtaposition of the two movies, and you can see why.
Absolutely, but both were very, very well received, and I think almost more surprising with Barbie. People kind of initially kind of thought Barbie was going to be a whatever movie, and it turned out to be one of the highest grossing movies of the year. And and it was like critically well received. It got a ton of Oscar nominations. And Greta Gerwig, she's this kind of up and coming director who this is her third feature. And not to give too many away, to spoil too much, but we might be tackling some more Greta Gerwig as well. So,
which I'm excited for. I don't know a lot about Greta Gerwig.
Yeah.
I think it's great to get some diversity into this room. Far too often, I think we cleave to, if filmmaking, like many things, like everything, is an old boys club, and it ought not to be. I think we deprive ourselves of great work when we deprive ourselves of diversity in art and science and all aspects of life. So yeah, more power to more voices is a good thing for us all. So I'm excited to give Greta Gerwig her due consideration.
Absolutely. And we're going to see if Barbie is a hell of a picture. I'm excited.
It's a hell of a doll. We know that.
I tell you. So yeah, for this, that's been another week of hell of a picture. And thanks to David, and I'm Andrew, and we'll see you guys next week for Barbie.
Later.